Make sure you're sitting down for this one. A rich and privileged prince is possibly being given preferential treatment. You know, I'm not the biggest fan of Meghan and Harry. I know, shocker, right? But every once in a while, the media picks up a whiff of something and turns it into this clickbait storm that just swirls around the internet in a flurry, and sometimes that gets a bit much. I'm sure you've seen the sensational headlines about how Prince Harry is getting deported from the US, or is getting his visa cancelled, or is getting banned from re-entering the country if he ever leaves because of his admitted drug use. Now, because some people on the internet just love to misinterpret whatever people say or completely imagine things that are not said and imagine offense, let me be clear. I am in no way trivializing drug use, especially illicit drug use that could cost people's lives. While I've never dabbled myself, I've never even drank alcohol, and I don't personally know anyone who's been destroyed by drugs, I understand the gravity of the topic. And I do talk about that aspect in a prior video that I made recently called The Enabler, in which I covered the monetized therapy session between Harry and Dr. Gabor Mate. So please do check out that video if you haven't already. The purpose of this video, though, is to focus on this whole immigration, deportation, visa thing that has been just, spreading around like wildfire over the past couple of days. The outrage over Harry's admitted drug use, and indeed his praise of drugs, is nothing new at this point. He's been doing it very openly ever since his book Spare was released almost 3 months ago now. But this entire issue of his US visa and his immigration status has really been put front and center after an organization based in the States called the Heritage Foundation filed a Freedom of Information request to gain access to Prince Harry's visa application. Now, a Freedom of Information request is just a formal request for information that you lodge with the relevant department on a specific individual or even a company. And the reason claimed by the Heritage Foundation for their Freedom of Information request is to find out whether the laws have been applied to Prince Harry when it comes to immigration to the States, and specifically whether he lied to officials in his documentation, which is a very big deal if that were to be true. I mean, all you have to do is look at Amber Heard, who was prosecuted and she pleaded guilty to falsifying immigration documents when she lied and stated that her dogs Pistol and Boo were not on board with her on her flight to Australia. She basically smuggled them in illegally, and I don't know much about the States, I've never been, but here in Australia, we have a very strict border security, very strict immigration laws to preserve our own flora and fauna. We're a very isolated island, and we have actually successfully kept out certain diseases, for example, entirely. The Heritage Foundation has also gone as far as compiling a dossier of evidence against Prince Harry, including admissions made by Harry in his own book and in various interviews, and I'm assuming the one with Dr. Gabor Mate is on top of that list. And they've sent this dossier to the Department of Homeland Security to support their Freedom of Information request. Now, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank, so many proponents of Harry and Meghan might be thinking, oh, well, this is clearly a political agenda because Harry and Meghan have all but declared their allegiance to the Democratic Party. They're very clearly Democrats. But if you listen to Niall Gardner, who is a director of the Heritage Foundation, this is what he had to say on the motives behind this Freedom of Information request and this push for transparency.
This is an issue of accountability and transparency, and there should not be under any circumstances preferential treatment given to a public figure like Prince Harry.
I think before we really sink our teeth into this topic, I believe it's important for anyone who talks about it to openly acknowledge to the audience that we don't have the information to be able to make a definitive assessment on whether Harry lied, whether he falsified documents, and whether he's being given preferential treatment. And based on the response to the Freedom of Information request, which was basically a refusal to share any of the information requested, I don't think we will ever know. And so based on this, the most comfortable position for me is to explore the two main arguments that have been put forth by people who are pushing for accountability on Harry's part and people who are saying this is much ado about nothing. Please don't mistake my conveyance of these two arguments as being my own argument and my own beliefs, but I will weigh in with my own opinions wherever necessary. When it comes to freedom of information requests, at least here in Australia, there is a balancing act that is performed between the competing rights. So, for example, in Harry's case, there is his right to privacy versus what the Heritage Foundation argues is a matter of public interest. So their argument is that this is a matter of public interest because the American taxpayer has the right to know what their government is doing, how they're handling these things. Is the law being applied fairly and equally to everyone? Now, as I mentioned earlier, officials in the US have refused access to this sensitive information, citing Harry's privacy rights under Section 222F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. They've also refused to answer questions about how his admitted drug use might complicate things for him. Once again, citing Harry's privacy rights as stipulated by the legislation, because their argument is this is all in relation to his visa status, his visa application, and we treat all of those with the utmost confidentiality, not just Prince Harry's. And quite frankly, when I first read about the Heritage Organization's attempts to gain access to this information, my instinct was that it was going to go nowhere because of this balancing act that I already talked to you about. Harry's privacy rights in this instance simply outweighed the public interest argument, if it exists at all. Your opinion may vary on that one. Now, it's not the end of the line. I mean, anyone can challenge a decision made by the government. I mean, Prince Harry's doing it himself with his judicial review for his police protection. So theoretically, the Heritage Foundation could pursue this further, but it's going to cost a lot of time and a lot of money. Another thing I want to stress is just because the Freedom of Information request was denied, that doesn't mean that the matter should just end, particularly if Harry did commit wrongdoing and was dishonest in his application. If he was, then I believe that an investigation should be launched into the application in the interests of equality and fairness, because from what I've been hearing, that is a course of action that is taken with your average Joe, who doesn't happen to be an elitist. But again, I stress this is assuming there has been wrongdoing. There may not have been. From what I've heard and from what I understand about traveling to the US, it is quite a rigorous process. And drug-related offenses don't appear to be a joke in the States either. There have been instances of foreigners who have never been charged with or arrested over a drug-related offense being denied entry into the States. And this hasn't been limited to your private, regular person who's not famous or well-connected. British chef Nigella Lawson back in 2014 was either denied boarding a flight to the States or was removed from the flight because of a prior admission that she had apparently made to using drugs in the course of court testimony. But what's annoying in the media is that they stop there. They mention that Nigella story and they don't tell you what happened next. Well, I looked into it a little bit further. That ban was subsequently overturned when US officials invited her to reapply for a visa and promised that her application would be handled routinely and expeditiously. So essentially, we're so sorry for what happened. We're going to compensate you by not only overturning the ban, but fast-tracking your entire application. And somehow, I don't think your regular average Joe would have, received that sort of apology. I also remember reading that if you're merely suspected of having dabbled in drugs in the past, you could be asked to answer this medical questionnaire and submit to medical testing to make sure that you're clean before you enter the country. Now, Prince Harry being who he is, I highly doubt that he was subjected to such rigorous measures. But again, they may not have any reason to suspect him of anything. Whether a young man experimenting with drugs, 20 years ago is cause for denying him entry into the country is honestly up to you to decide, and up to the Department of Immigration to decide, because they have stated that they decide applications on a case-by-case basis. So there isn't a strict one-size-fits-all approach, which of course benefits the elites, like we saw with Nigella Lawson, where, one rule applies to them, and perhaps if you're not famous, another one applies to you. As for the question of whether he falsified documents, it is important to understand what the question was, because based on the little research I was able to do in this area, it looks like you're questioned about whether you've ever violated any laws relating to illegal drug use. Now, I don't know what the intended meaning of violate the laws is, because it could be the mere use of drugs, like in Nigella's case, is considered a violation and enough grounds for a ban, even though it was temporary in her case. Or you could argue that violate laws is the very strict definition of getting arrested and getting charged. So it all does depend on the meaning of things. And in this instance, if it was the latter definition, which is have you ever actually been arrested or charged, then even if Harry said no, he didn't lie. In terms of Harry's current drug use, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's openly admitted to using weed, which is legal where he lives in California. So he's untouchable in that regard. The opposing argument is that simply admitting to dabbling in drugs in your past, in your youth, isn't enough grounds for a ban or a deportation or a canceling of a visa, etc., etc. And when you look at things realistically, when you look at how things operate in the real world rather than the strict black and white written rule of the law, this argument seems to fall more in line with what we can expect. Meaning, someone confessing to something in a memoir, something that he's done in the past, is probably not going to factor much and lead to a very serious order, such as a deportation. I mean, think about it. If every single foreign celebrity or, elitist who penned a memoir or wrote a song about their drug use was either actually banned or deported or at risk of being so, I somehow don't think that many of these foreign celebrities would be all too keen on going anywhere near the States. And that's not even considering the foreign celebrities who are currently in the US taking drugs in parties, distributing them. We've read about Harry's story from, Courtney Cox's house in 2016. I don't know if that's a true story. I think she came out and denied it. But regardless of whether that one is true, we know it happens. It's undeniable. Are all these celebrities at risk of getting deported and, having their visas canceled? I think we all know the answer. Probably not. But don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's a fair world that we live in and this is the right approach. I specifically said celebrities and elitists. So while I don't know anyone personally and I've never heard of anyone getting deported from the States because of their personal drug use or admitting to prior drug use, I've heard in news reports that there have been people who have gone through that experience. I suppose the main question is, will anything actually ever come of this? Which is of course impossible to answer because we don't know what Harry said or didn't say in his visa application or any other relevant immigration document. Because for all we know, he may have done nothing wrong. And if he has done something wrong, then I don't think my answer is going to change. I still don't think that anything is ever going to come of this because of his status in the world as an elitist. Let me give you an example. I was subjected to several random drug tests in the army. And Harry being Harry, I do wonder whether he was subjected to the same, because he did admit to using drugs, although he may have been clean in the army. I don't know. I do know that I read a story circulating around the time Spare was released of Harry basically being allowed to leave base during the drug tests and being, given the all clear as soon as the tests were concluded. I don't know if that's true, but does it seem likely? I mean, after reading Spare and the way that high-ranking military officials were bending over backwards to make his life easier and to give him what he wants, I wouldn't be surprised. Because like I said in my review of Spare, Harry's experience of the army is not an accurate reflection of what we, average Joes had to go through. The intention of this video really was just to remind people not to get swept up in the media storm of clickbait and sensational headlines, because while I do believe in certain reports and I talk about them on my channel, this one to me really stood out as being really inflated when we have no evidence, not a single one of us, not even the Heritage Foundation, of Harry falsifying documents or lying. In terms of preferential treatment, and the sky is blue. I mean, come on. We all know that elitists like Harry and like Nigella Lawson even just have the longer end of the stick. It's just reality. And it can be infuriating seeing one set of standards for the 1% while the rest of us are made to suffer and, quite frankly, are thrown in prison over much less serious offenses. Oof. I think that's it for today. I didn't even get to touch upon the ridiculous demands that these two have been making, in exchange for their attendance at the coronation. Or I should say allegedly been making, because I don't know if it's true, but it sounds true, based on what we know about them. But I will be covering it next week. And speaking of next week, I have a surprise for you. So stick around and you might just find out what it is.